We're counting down the 30 cowboy suppers trail hands ate after 14 hours in the saddle. These were the meals that fueled men across 1,000 miles of dust and danger, cooked over an open fire by a man called Cookie, and wolfed down in the dark before the next watch. From beans that simmered all day in a cast iron pot to puddings that turned flour and suet into a rare sweet reward, each dish tells a story of grit, hunger, and hard-won comfort on the open range. Expect cuts of meat city folk would not touch, flavors forged in smoke and sweat, and the quiet pride of feeding tired men on the move. Which trail supper tops our list? Let's begin the countdown with number 30. Number 30. Hardtack was the cracker that refused to die, a slab of flour and water baked until it could turn a hammer. On the long drives north out of Texas in the 1870s, a sack of hardtack rode in the chuckwagon as insurance against the days when nothing else kept. The biscuits were so dense a man could crack a tooth on them dry, so the trick was to drop one into a tin cup of boiling coffee and wait until it softened enough to chew. It carried no flavor worth naming and no joy at all, but after 14 hours in the saddle, a belly full of soaked hardtack meant a man could sleep. It was survival in a square, plain, and unloved. Number 29. Cornmeal mush, what some old hands called kush, filled the gaps when the flour ran low and payday was still 300 miles up the trail. Cookie stirred coarse meal into salted boiling water until it thickened into a heavy porridge, then ladled it steaming into tin plates. Cheap and filling, a sack of cornmeal cost only pennies a pound and stretched across a crew of a dozen men. What was left cooled overnight into a firm slab, sliced the next morning, and fried in bacon fat until crisp and golden at the edges. It was the kind of dish nobody bragged about, yet on a gray dawn before a cold ride, that fried mush was the difference between an empty man and a working one. Number 28. Beef jerky rode in every saddlebag from the Chisholm Trail to the high plains of Montana. When a steer was butchered, the lean meat was cut into thin ribbons, rubbed with salt, and hung over the wagon or draped on bushes to cure in the dry prairie wind. Within a few days, it turned dark, leathery, and light enough to carry for weeks without spoiling. A cowboy gnawed on a strip in the saddle when the herd would not let him near the wagon. The salt and the slow chew, enough to take the edge off a hunger that had no end. It tasted of smoke, dust, and patience. Long before refrigeration reached the cattle country, jerky was how the West kept its meat and how a working man kept moving. Number 27. Sobelly, the cured side meat city folk called salt pork, was the grease that ran the whole outfit. Packed in barrels of brine, it kept for the length of a 4-month drive and showed up at nearly every meal in some form. Cookie sliced it thin and fried it crisp, then used the rendered fat to cook everything else in the wagon, from biscuits to beans to a man's morning eggs when eggs could be found. But fat was fuel on the trail, and Sobelly delivered the calories a man burned through in a day of branding, roping, and riding drag in the dust. It was not loved. It was simply always there. Number 26. Corn dodgers were the rough bread of the range, made when there was no time and no oven worth the name. Cookie mixed cornmeal, salt, and water, sometimes a little grease, then shaped the stiff dough into oblong cakes and dropped them into a hot, greased skillet. They fried up crusty on the outside and dense within, sturdy enough to ride in a coat pocket for the long afternoon watch. A cowboy ate them with beans, dunked them in stew gravy, or simply gnawed them plain when nothing else was offered. They asked nothing of the cook and forgave a heavy hand. On a trail where a man might eat from horseback, the corn dodger's great virtue was that it traveled, holding together where softer breads fell apart. It was humble work, and it fed thousands. Number 25. Cowboy coffee was the lifeblood of the camp, and on most outfits it was arbuckles, the roasted Ariosa beans sold in a yellow paper sack that became almost legend across the cattle country. Cookie tossed a fistful of ground straight into a blackened pot of water, set it over the coals, and boiled it hard until it ran thick, dark, and strong enough to float a horseshoe. There was no straining and no fuss, just a settled cup poured before the morning ride and again at the end of the day. The peppermint stick tucked in each sack of arbuckles was a small prize a man might trade for. Coffee kept the night herders awake through the long watches and warmed cold hands at dawn. No supper on the trail was truly complete without it. Number 24. Red-eye gravy and biscuits turned a few scraps of cured pork into a breakfast that could carry a man for hours. After frying the salt pork or ham, Cookie poured a splash of strong black coffee into the hot drippings, scraping up every browned bit until the pan ran with a thin, glistening red-brown sauce. There was no flour to thicken it and no cream to soften it, just the elemental marriage of pork and the pot. Old hands swore by it on a frosty morning, the kind of fuel that sat heavy and stayed with you through a long ride. It was poverty cooking raised to ritual, born of having little and wasting nothing. Number 23. Stewed dried apples were the small sweetness that broke the monotony of beans and beef. Apples sliced and sun-dried, back in town, traveled in cotton sacks that took up almost no room in the wagon, and a few handfuls swelled into a generous pot, once soaked overnight and simmered with sugar. The kitchen, if you could call a fire ring a kitchen, filled with the warm scent of fruit and cinnamon when Cookie could spare the spice. Served warm in a tin cup, the soft apples tasted like a memory of home to men who had not seen a house in months. On a trail starved for sweetness, that humble fruit was a quiet luxury. Number 22, molasses, what Cowboy simply called lick, was the sweetener that hung on the chuckwagon and sweetened nearly everything that needed it. Thick, dark, and pungent, a jug of sorghum or blackstrap cost little and lasted long, and a spoonful could lift a plain biscuit, a slab of fried mush, or a bowl of cornmeal into something worth looking forward to. Men poured it over flapjacks and stirred it into coffee when the sugar ran out. The wagon's lick bucket drew flies in the heat and crusted at the rim, but no one minded. In a world where dessert was rare and candy a distant dream, a finger swipe through the molasses jug was a small theft no cook bothered to punish. It was the taste of small mercy on a hard trail. Number 21. Bacon, the prized side meat that was not quite as salty as sowbelly, was the closest thing to a treat among the cured pork. When the outfit was well provisioned, Cookie fried thick slices until the fat ran and the edges crackled, the smell rising over the camp at dawn and drawing sleepy men from their bedrolls. The grease was never wasted, saved in a can to fry the next meal and the one after that. A cowboy ate his bacon alongside biscuits and beans or rolled it in a folded corn dodger to eat one-handed in the saddle. When the bacon barrel ran dry, the whole crew felt it, and the days of plain sowbelly stretched ahead like the trail itself. Number 20, pinto beans, the frijoles every Texas outfit cooked by the gallon, were the true backbone of the trail. Cookie set them soaking the night before, then simmered them all day in a heavy iron pot with a chunk of salt pork and onion if he had one, and whatever chiles he could lay hands on. By supper time they had cooked down soft and creamy, the broth gone thick and savory with pork fat. Beans were cheap, filling, and packed with the protein a working man needed, and a cattle outfit could move tons of them up the trail without worry of spoiling. Some hands ate beans at every meal for weeks and never complained, because beans meant a full belly. Around the fire, the bean pot was where the day's stories were told. Number 19, vinegar pie was the cook's clever answer to a kitchen with no fruit for 100 miles. When the dried apples ran out and the trail offered nothing fresh, Cookie reached for what the wagon always carried: eggs when he had them, sugar, flour, and a splash of vinegar. Whisked together and baked in a Dutch oven crust, the tang of the vinegar somehow mimicked the brightness of citrus or apples, fooling tired men into believing they were eating proper pie. It set into a custard that was tart, sweet, and surprisingly satisfying. Cowboys who tasted it remembered it for years, half in disbelief that vinegar could turn into something so good. Number 18, Spotted Pup was the camp's beloved dessert, a homely pudding of rice and raisins that earned its odd name from the dark fruit speckling the pale grains. Cookie boiled rice until soft, stirred in raisins, sugar, and a tin of canned milk when the wagon carried it, sometimes a dusting of cinnamon for celebration. The result was warm, creamy, and sweet, a rare comfort that drew grins from grown men who had spent the day eating dust. On a good night it appeared after a supper of beans and beef, and the crew lined up tin plates with the eagerness of children. For many a cowboy, that bowl of rice and raisins was the sweetest thing the open range ever offered. Number 17, sourdough flapjacks rose from the starter. Every good cook kept guarded like treasure, a living pot of fermented dough that gave its sour tang to half the wagon's bread. Before dawn, Cookie thinned a measure of starter with flour and water, let it bubble, then ladled the batter onto a hot, greased griddle where it spread and blistered and turned golden. Stacked high and drowned in molasses or sprinkled with sugar, the cakes vanished as fast as he could cook them. Men ate them by the dozen, fuel for a day that started in the dark and ended the same way. The faint sourness was the taste of the trail itself, of a starter carried for months and fed faithfully so it never died. A camp with no flapjacks was a camp with a careless cook. Number 16, pan de campo, the round camp bread of the Texas borderlands, was baked flat in a Dutch oven buried in coals. Mixed from flour, baking powder, salt, lard, and water, the dough was patted into a thick disc, set in the heavy iron pot, and covered with glowing embers until it rose golden and crackled at the crust. The Tejano vaqueros who rode alongside the Anglo cowboys brought the recipe north, and it spread through the outfits like wildfire. Torn into hunks while still hot, it sopped up bean broth and stew gravy better than anything. Plain as it was, pan de campo fed generations of riders and outlasted the trails that carried it. Number 15, saw gravy, the thick white sauce some cooks called sawmill gravy, stretched a little grease and flour into something that could blanket a whole plate. Cookie whisked flour into hot bacon or sausage drippings until it browned, then poured in milk or even water and stirred until it thickened into a pale, peppery gravy. Ladled over split biscuits, it turned a dry breakfast into a hot, sticking meal that sat with a man through a morning of branding. Spiked hard with black pepper, it had a bite that woke a man up. To sop the last of it with a torn biscuit was a small ceremony repeated at 1,000 campfires, the comfort of cheap food made well. Number 14, dried apple pie was the prize the whole outfit watched for, the dessert that turned an ordinary supper into an event. Cookie soaked the dried apples until they plumped, stewed them soft with sugar and spice, then sealed them in a crust and baked the whole thing in a Dutch oven nested in coals. When he lifted the lid to reveal a golden, fragrant pie out on the empty plains, hardened men went quiet with anticipation. The apples cost little and traveled forever, yet the labor was real, and a cook who took the trouble earned the lasting loyalty of his crew. A wedge of warm pie eaten off a tin plate by firelight was as close to heaven as the trail ever came. Cowboys remembered those pies long after they remembered the cattle. Number 13, calf fries, the dish polite folk called Rocky Mountain oysters, came straight from the spring branding when bull calves were cut. Nothing on a working ranch went to waste, so the testicles were peeled, sliced, rolled in seasoned flour, and fried crisp in hot grease right there at the fire. The taste surprised the squeamish, mild and tender, somewhere near a chicken gizzard, and the men who had done the cutting ate them with a grin and a dare for the greenhorns. It was thrift and bravado on the same plate, a frontier delicacy born of the calendar rather than the menu. Around the branding fire, calf fries marked the season as surely as the smell of singed hide. They belonged to a world where every part of the animal earned its place, and a man learned not to ask too many questions. Number 12. Jerky stew brought the dried meat back to life on nights when no fresh beef was at hand. Cookie broke the leathery strips into pieces and simmered them slowly in water until they softened and surrendered their salt and smoke into the broth, then added beans, a handful of cornmeal, or whatever vegetables had survived the journey. Hours over a low fire turned the toughest jerky tender and the thin water rich and dark. After a freezing watch, a bowl of jerky stew steaming in the cold did more than feed a man. It thawed him. Plain and slow, it was the quiet workhorse of the long drives. Number 11. Refried beans, the frijoles refritos, the vaqueros taught the trail to love, gave yesterday's bean pot a second and better life. Cookie mashed the leftover pintos and fried them in hot lard until they thickened into a rich, savory paste, the edges crisping and the smell pulling men toward the fire. Spread on pan de campo or scooped with a corn dodger, they tasted deeper and earthier than the simple boiled beans of the night before. It was thrift turned into something craved, the kind of dish that proved a good cook never threw food away. The Mexican hands who rode the drives shared this knowledge freely, and it became a fixture of Texas trail cooking. For the price of a little fat and a little effort, the humble bean was reborn as a feast. Number 10. Stewed prunes were the trail's standing joke and its quiet remedy, the dried fruit Cookie kept for both dessert and a man's regular health. Months of beans, salt pork, and biscuit took a toll on the gut, and a pot of prunes, simmered soft with sugar, set things right again. Cowboys grumbled and they ate them anyway, half by craving and half by need, sometimes folded into a sweet pudding with rice or bread. There was a running humor about the prune pot, the kind that bound a crew together as much as the work did. Beneath the jokes, it was practical care, a cook looking after men too proud to admit they needed looking after. Number 9. Chili con carne carried the heat of the Texas frontier in a single pot, a dish born where the cattle country met Mexico. Cookie browned beef, often the tougher cuts, then stewed it long with dried red chilies, cumin, garlic, and whatever made the wagon, the meat falling apart and the broth turning deep and fiery. On the southern drives, the child peppers were cheap and plentiful, and the spice-masked meat that had seen better days while warming a man straight through. Served over beans or sopped up with camp bread, it was bold, hot, and unforgettable. It was the flavor of the borderlands made portable, riding north with the herds and feeding men who had earned a little fire on the tongue. Number 8. Cowboy Mulligan was the everything stew, the pot that swallowed whatever the wagon and the day happened to offer. A chunk of fresh beef, a handful of beans, some potatoes if the outfit was lucky, an onion, a few wild greens gathered on the ride, all simmered together in the big iron pot until the flavors married into something greater than its parts. No two mulligans were ever the same because no 2 days on the trail offered the same scraps. Cookie tasted and adjusted, stretching a little meat across a hungry crew with broth and bulk. After 14 hours in the saddle, a man did not care what was in the bowl, only that it was hot and there was plenty. The mulligan was the chuckwagon's genius, comfort conjured from chance and necessity. Number 7, boiled fresh beef was the rare reward when a steer was finally butchered on the drive, and the whole camp felt the difference. Most days the herd was money on the hoof, too valuable to eat, but now and then a lame or injured animal was killed, and for a few meals the outfit dined on meat that had not been salted or dried. Cookie boiled the tougher cuts long and slow with salt until they grew tender, the broth saved for soup and gravy. Fresh beef, after weeks of cured pork, tasted like a celebration, and men ate until they could eat no more, knowing the bounty would not last. Nothing was wasted, from the marrow bones to the offal. That brief stretch of fresh meat marked the high points of a drive, savored all the more because it was so fleeting. Number 6, chicken fried steak rose out of the trail's need to make tough beef worth eating, and it became one of the West's most enduring dishes. A cheap, sinewy cut was pounded thin with the edge of a plate or the back of a knife, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried hard in deep grease until the crust turned crisp and golden, the way fried chicken did. Smothered in saw gravy and served with biscuits, it transformed the least promising meat into something a man looked forward to. Cowboys who could afford little ate it with relish, and ranch kitchens across Texas kept it alive long after the great drives ended. It remains the taste of the cattle country, born of making the most of the least. Number 5, roasted beef ribs over open coals were the feast of feasts, reserved for the days a steer was killed and the crew gathered to celebrate a finished drive or a hard task done. Cookie set the racks of ribs over a bed of glowing embers, turning them slowly as the fat dripped and flared and the meat charred at the edges and pulled tender from the bone. The smell carried for 100 yards across the prairie and drew every man in camp like a magnet. Eaten with the hands greasy and smoke-stained and grinning, the crew tore into ribs that needed no sauce but a little salt. It was the closest the trail came to true plenty, a primal pleasure shared around the fire. For men who lived on beans and biscuit, a rack of fire-roasted ribs was paradise on the plains. Number 4, Dutch oven peach cobbler crowned the rare good nights, the dessert that could make a crew forget every mile of dust behind them. Cookie soaked dried peaches until they swelled sweet and soft, sugared them well, then dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough over the top and buried the heavy iron pot in coals. Out of the wilderness, with no oven and no fresh fruit for hundreds of miles, he produced a bubbling golden cobbler that filled the dusk with the smell of caramelized peaches. Grown men crowded the fire like boys at a fair. Served warm in a tin cup, the soft fruit and tender crust tasted like a miracle conjured from dried scraps and skill. A cook who made a good cobbler was worth his weight in gold to an outfit. It turned a campsite for one night into home. Number 3, son of a gun in a sack, was the trail's grand pudding, a sweet boiled dough that took real effort and paid it back in joy. Cookie mixed flour, suet, sugar, raisins, and spice into a stiff dough, packed it into a clean flour sack, tied it tight, and boiled it for hours until it swelled into a dense, fragrant pudding. Turned out steaming and sliced thick, it was drowned in a sweet sauce or molasses and devoured by men who rarely tasted anything so rich. The dish, borrowed from the old steamed puddings of the East and the British Isles, carried west and adapted to a wagon's means. On a cold night after a long drive, that hot pudding lifted the whole camp's spirits. It was proof that even on the bleakest trail, a good cook could conjure a little celebration from a sack of flour and suet. Number 2, son of a gun stew, was the legendary dish of the cattle country, the meal that defined what a trail cook could do with the parts no one else wanted. When a calf was butchered, Cookie gathered the heart, liver, tongue, sweetbreads, and the prized marrow gut, then simmered them slow for hours with salt, pepper, and chiles until the rough offal melted into a rich, savory stew unlike anything else on the range. The marrow gut gave it a flavor men argued over and craved in equal measure. It demanded skill, patience, and a strong stomach. and a cook who made it well earned a reputation that followed him from outfit to outfit. Nothing of the animal was wasted, and out of the humblest scraps came the dish Cowboy spoke of with reverence. It was the soul of trail cooking, hard-won and fiercely beloved. Number 1. Sourdough biscuits crowned the chuckwagon as the heart of every outfit, the bread that rose or fell on the cook's living starter. That bubbling pot of fermented dough was the most guarded treasure in camp, kept warm in cold weather, fed faithfully, sometimes carried for years from drive to drive so it never died. Each morning, Cookie worked flour, lard, and a measure of starter into a dough, cut it into rounds, and baked them golden in a Dutch oven sealed with coals, the smell pulling men from their bedrolls before the first light. Split hot and slathered with molasses or sopped in gravy, those biscuits were the steady comfort that anchored every meal, day after endless day. A great cook was judged first by his biscuits, and a good batch could hold a crew's loyalty better than wages. More than any other supper, the sourdough biscuit was the taste of the trail itself, the daily miracle that kept the West fed and moving. Across all 30 entries, from the unloved hardtack that opened our list to the treasured sourdough biscuits at the very top, these cowboy suppers tell a story of grit, thrift, and quiet ingenuity. Some, like son of a gun stew and calf fries, remind us of a time when nothing was wasted, while others, like peach cobbler and dried apple pie, show how a clever cook could conjure sweetness from a wagon full of dried scraps. The common thread is the man at the fire, feeding hungry riders with little more than flour, beans, and skill, turning the hardest days into something a crew could gather around. These were more than meals. They were the warmth at the end of 14 hours in the saddle, and the reason the West got fed at all.